Hi, we're Candor Beach, and we're here to talk to you about globalization today. Sailesh, pros of globalization, what are they?
So globalization brings access to goods and services all over the
Mm-hmm.
world. It helps in spread of technology and innovation, like how U.S. actually sent its tech to build aircrafts, jets. That is transfer of technology to India. That is a part of globalization. Second, that's another one is cooperation between the nations. So going through all this process of transfer of technology or innovation it needs cooperation.
Oh, this is how the British have chicken tikka as their national
Yeah,
dish.
yeah.
Or is that butter chicken? Chicken tikka.
I believe chicken tikka. Yeah.
And how we have access to French fries.
And I think one of the biggest problem with that is loss of jobs in the first world countries. Like you can just outsource it, send it to China for cheap labor. Like,
Yeah, that's an interesting fact. I think there are a couple of other pieces, right? There is the Cantillon effect that comes into play when it comes to globalization, because wealth is primarily dispersed from the font, and if it's distributing from the people who get first access to it, it does not necessarily see the required penetration to uplift society in general. So there's increased inequality. There's I would also say that there's increased environmental degradation in certain countries. Like when you have South America, when you have the likes of India, and you have massive deforestation in certain areas for mineral mining, for wood. I say deforestation in South America because that's a recent phenomenon that people are trying to tackle. A couple of decades back, or a decade and a half back, there used to be instances where nuclear waste was sent to developing countries to dispose of, to clean and dispose and
yeah,
what have you. So
recycle.
yeah, increased inequality, environmental degradation, loss of jobs. I think those are your primary issues. And that leads to deglobalization. So we've seen instances of deglobalization. We've seen, because there's increased inequality, governments have to step in. They have to protect their domestic interests to make sure that businesses here can also survive and maybe thrive. So you have protectionism in certain environments. Um, with the COVID with the COVID supply chain breakdown, we saw that nations required a certain degree of self-sufficiency, like I need to meet the base requirement. Like when I say base, I'm thinking about the Maslow's need hierarchy. Like I need to be able to provide my people with food security and the industries with what they require, the bare minimum they require to grow, which just happened to be semiconductor chips all of last year and a couple of years,
Yeah,
I mean,
the
during
chip
the COVID
shortage.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I need to be able to address this inequality somehow. Like, I need to ensure that the concentration of wealth isn't held with the fund primarily, but all around, like it's spread.
So I think COVID expedited deglobalization. It actually caused the fault lines to be exposed. So if you look at it, there are countries which control the finance of the world, and
Mm-hmm.
there are countries which control the commodity sector of the world. Or I would say the energy and the food. So it brought out the fight between both these the beasts. So one is the financial sector countries, and one is the commodity sector countries. So it also caused the rise of civilization states. So civilization state, I would say, is like basically a country which is fully self-sustaining by itself, but and with the least amount of imports. So
Can you give
and
me an example?
you can take Russia as a civilization state. So Russia, when the war started,
Highlighted by the war.
yeah,
Yeah.
when the war started, everybody thought Russia got sanctioned, and everybody thought Russia going to collapse, which did not happen. Russian currency actually strengthened post the war, so it actually became stronger than pre-war. So There are instances like that. So the rise of civilization states, and this also led to the major fight between the countries which are controlling the SWIFT
The
network.
finances versus
Yeah.
yeah.
So like the all the countries took note to see that why did they kicked us out of the SWIFT network, and
Yeah,
that
now if Russia's kicked out, then every country is vulnerable. Like if you cross the countries that control the SWIFT network, they can just kill your value in seconds.
exactly.
So that's a reasonable, I don't want to say reasonable reason, but that's a reasonable reason to take a step back from globalization. But what are countries doing to tackle this?
So one of the major things which is coming up, I think in August, there's a new currency which is going to be launched.
I don't know if it's going to be launched. They're
They're
discussing
talking
it.
about it, and the BRICS currency, which is
Yeah.
going to be pegged to the gold. They're talking about launching it, and there are about 41 countries which applied for the membership of BRICS.
Mm-hmm.
So if that happens, it's going to challenge the supremacy of a dollar.
All right, but from what I read, India wasn't overly thrilled about this.
Yeah, India wants to basically strengthen its own currency, and India has a deep-rooted diplomatic stance with the Western nations. So it's not in the greatest interest of India because if BRICS currency do launch, it's going to be China-centric.
Right. And that I think is a major play that the world needs to stand up and pay attention to, that building up another Euro bloc or something that's akin to another Euro bloc is going to be susceptible to some of the same issues. It is going to have a hegemony of certain countries. Within the group. You are going to have potential collapses if you invite or bring in new members that aren't as economically stable as the rest of the group. But that also brings in the question of pegging. You said that we were talking about bringing back the gold standard.
Yes.
Versus the existing peg, which is based on like a credit system.
Yeah. The existing system has no value. Like in a matter of
Can't say it
seconds.
has no value. Clearly, we've been operating for a few decades on that.
American dollar can be increased at a blink of an eye. They literally.
What do you mean by that?
The entire American dollar circulation, 30% of it was printed in the last 4 years. So there is no standard to it. They can if they really want to increase it, they can increase the circulation.
So here's a question. So 30% increase over the last 4 years, but did that affect the value of the dollar? Like I've increased supply.
Yeah. You see all the Western countries, including not just Western countries, everything, the inflation went through the roof. America saw 10% inflation, highest in 40 years. Europe saw, I think it was 8.9 or 9% inflation, highest in 35 years. Inflation went through the roof. That led to the Fed coming in trying to raise the interest rates, right?
Which speaks to the inequality that we were talking about, right? Like it affects some more than others.
It really strengthens whenever they raise the interest rates, it strengthens the dollar more, and all the currencies which are around the world, they lose the value. So we went from, I remember we were at 72 rupees per $1. We went to 82 rupees to $1.
Back when we studied in the US, you and I think we'd gone in 2009, right?
I was in 2010. Yeah, you were in 2009. Yes.
That was what, 50 rupees to $1?
No, it was 45, I believe.
45.
Yeah.
And now, what? It's 2023, so that's 14 years. So nearly a decade and a half later, we are sitting at twice the price.
Yeah.
Is that inflation, or is that the US running away with value? Like, are we not creating sufficient value at pace, I mean?
I mean, it is inflation, and U.S. is also racking up debt. It's at $31 trillion. And they had to literally raise their debt limit recently to,
Again,
to cater to all the needs.
understood. So does it make sense to de-dollarize then? Like, if we are de-dollarizing, how are we going to go about it?
Once you have a challenger to the US dollar, right? So it's going to bring in, there's some rationality. So people are going to start thinking, do we want to increase, our debt at a fraction of a second? Or do we want to think, and all these excess government spending should be, like cut back, like, like excessive spending. Like you remember
No,
back
circling back to
yeah.
de-dollarization specifically, though, like, how are we going about with de-dollarization?
So
You said challenger.
Yeah, so the BRICS currency is going to cause de-dollarization. So that will, if
it's launched,
if it's launched and if
yeah.
it's successful in dethroning the dollar, so it's going to cause a lot of pain for the Americans, because it's the standard of living is going to fall, because American dollar is going to see hyperinflation.
Fascinating. And why haven't we seen that with cryptocurrency? Like, if I'm pegging the BRICS currency to gold, wouldn't that be akin to pegging it to anything that is of limited quantities, like the Bitcoin?
Sure, that is one of the major concepts, but there is an issue with a lot of countries not really liking the cryptocurrencies. So that's why in the past they did the gold, right? So they're comfortable with doing gold than the cryptocurrency.
I would also argue that there has been this whole, like, every country has some amount of gold, and you can control the rate of mining of gold. Bitcoin, for the most part, is like, you have mined it. Countries like El Salvador have accumulated a tremendous amount of Bitcoin, and they would end up being value allocators. Like, they would they would end up being allocators of resources, pardon me, while not having enough value to provide, like, versus other countries. I'm not saying El Salvador doesn't have any value. I'm saying that versus countries like China, versus countries like India or Russia or Brazil, for that matter, El Salvador does not contribute as much to the global economy. And so when they have a resource in plenty, but like, I wouldn't have any reason to go and say, yeah, I acknowledge you. Yeah, I would want for you to be a part of this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, El Salvador started with the crypto thing, right? They made
They're one of the more notable countries with the crypto
they
thing.
made Bitcoin with their standard currency. I mean, those are outliers, but majority of the countries are not comfortable with that. They rather launch their own CBDCs.
What do you think about, and this is a crazy thought, but what do you think about the metaverse coming in and challenging globalization? Like, at this point in time, we're talking about, like, the advantages that you had cited. You had talked about, let me see if I remember. You had talked about access to goods and services. You had talked about technology and innovation, the spread of technology and innovation, and you had talked about cultures. Now, if I create a virtual world, like the metaverse, the concept of the metaverse, exactly, wouldn't that accelerate these benefits?
Sure, but I think it's a fad. There was a hype and it fell off. It's like NFT hype. You remember when the NFT hype was there? Justin Bieber.
The Bored Apes.
Yeah, Bored Ape won for like 1.3 million, some $50,000 right now.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it's almost.
Wow.
He lost. I can't even say anything about that. So poor guy.
Yeah, we don't have $1 million to spend on something like that, so it's hard for us to fathom. But yeah, that's You think it's a fad, but
Yeah.
what would be the impediment to accumulating critical mass? Like, why do you think it's a fad?
So the metaverse, a lot of people are not going to be, like so integrated with the virtual, environment completely right away. It's going to take a lot more time for it to integrate.
So that's not a
Uh,
fad then, right? Like that's just in the innovator's curve, Rogers diffusion curve of innovation.
sure,
You're just at
sure.
the innovation level.
I'm saying it's a fad right now. The hype went down, but maybe eventually in the future, the hype might go up about it because just it's like the Bitcoin. Originally the Bitcoin, nobody wanted. There was a guy who bought 10,000, a pizza for like 10,000
Yeah.
Bitcoins, right? So and eventually it became $20,000, and now it was at it went to 3,000, then to 20,000. So there is.
And Standard Chartered predicts $120,000 per
Yeah,
Bitcoin.
so it all boils down to, I think, energy sector. Like one of the major things I was reading the other day was the One World One Grid initiative. The One Sun One World One Grid initiative by India. So basically connecting all the grids of all the countries, and whichever and bring renewable sources of energy to this grid.
So solar energy primarily.
Solar and wind, and yeah, solar. So let's say if you have one of the countries in the east getting all the sunlight at first, the west, the countries in the west will still, even though at nighttime for them, they can be supplied with energy. And same is going to happen when the west has enough light and there's not enough light in the eastern countries.
And also there are arguments that the incidence of light, the angle at which you receive light, it's going to be a little more direct around the tropical belt.
Yeah,
And so
temperate and tropical.
So you are going to have regions with inequality of production, but this grid ensures that the wealth is distributed, basically.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the evolutions of globalization. Even though the world is going towards the civilization part, I think they're trying to make the world the energy securities of all the countries in a better way, like securitizing all the countries' energy. So which is actually a very good initiative. Like I was reading about it, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi was actually started this, and I believe the first country which is actually starting to do it is Saudi Arabia. They're connecting the grid with India.
Interesting. And I will also say this, that it is not the simplest of, I mean, it's not the simplest of ideas. It isn't just like you put up a solar panel in a desert and you're done.
Yeah.
Like otherwise the Sahara could be covered with that. There are considerations towards not harming the ecosystem. There are considerations of maintenance. There
Yeah.
are considerations of energy transfer from point A to point B, because it's not going to be efficient. Otherwise, we'd have like hydrogen energy would have already been prolific at this point in time if transportation of energy was simple.
Yeah, like you remember well, Elon Musk had the idea, fill up Utah with all solar panels and supply the entire country with the power generated from those solar panels.
No, I hadn't read about that, but I
Yeah.
was reading about another interesting piece of technology wherein you launch satellites that redirect the solar energy that they've captured and wirelessly transmit it to specific areas around the world. I don't know, again, like operationally, it might be very inefficient. It might be very hard, but I think eventually with time, as technology gets better.
That was actually Tesla's idea, transmitting of electricity without conducting cables.
That'd be amazing.
So
Here's to that future. Like I don't have to I don't have to sit spending electricity at all. I don't want to have my iPhone sitting and charging on a charging mat. I like it to charge whenever, wherever. Just never
yeah.
lose battery.
So on the final thoughts, how is deglobalization going to affect education, mental health, and work-life balance of people. Like how much of is going to affect these minor sectors.
I think globalization at this point in time has strengthened some of these issues. It's because I've been competing so much more with my neighbors, with countries where the labor is cheaper. I've had to put in much more work, as an example, much more hours at lower rates, and that has hurt mental health. That is something that can be that deglobalization, or in general, like I don't think we need something as extreme as deglobalization, but more of an understanding that this is what needs to be brought in.
What about the work-life balance with the deglobalization part? Like how much of this is going to affect IT sector employees? Like will this increase their workload, or will they decrease their workload? What do you think? You're in that sector too.
I don't think deglobalization will have any effect on it. Like if I know that you're going to work for 9 hours, 10 hours, 11 hours, you as a culture are hardworking, so to say, like with Japan or with India or the East more than the West. America is also known for this, right?
Yeah.
Then I'm going to make you work as much as is expected. I wouldn't care about globalization or deglobalization.
So work-life balance really doesn't get affected by deglobalization or globalization.
No, I don't think so.
All right. So any closing thoughts?
I would say that globalization's been around for multiple centuries. I think the Silk Trade route is an example, started in the BCEs, if I remember correctly. It's existed for 2 millennia. It is unlikely to unwind overnight. It is unlikely to unwind, if at all, because the advantages are quite strong. Deglobalization, like you had said, to use the example that you had spoken of, there will be civilization states. I will want a certain degree of independence fueled from within. But at the same time, I am still going to partner. I am still going to trade. I am still going to exchange cultural views across borders.
Yeah. I mean, it's an evolution of globalization. It's not going to be completely deglobalized, but the countries are going to look for self-sustenance. Yeah.
All right then. On that note, thank you very much for joining us on this pod. We'll see you on the next one.
Thank you, everybody.